So we are going to continue to cover APIs and HTTP front ends today. A quick recap from earlier in the week. You all have been covering servers, which are essentially software or hardware that handles either requests from either, well, clients really. So that could either be browsers, other applications, and it handles this through requests and responding to those requests with response. And so the format, the syntax is very similar for both. They consist of headers and bodies, and for a request line, and for the response, a response status line. When we talk about servers and communication between, let's say, a server and a client, we're kind of talking about APIs here. And API is basically, well, actually, let me ask the class, does anybody know what an API is, what it stands for?
It stands for Application Programming Interface.
It does. And basically, you could think of it as a service, right? So if we were to make an analogy between an API and, let's say, a waiter serving tables, the waiter is acting as an intermediary between you, the customer, and the chef. The customer being the front end, and the chef being the back end. So it's a collection of communication protocols and subroutines, really, at the end of the day. And it interprets between your input and how a third party will react to that input. And it's basically the link between the front end and the back end. The front end being what's user interactive, which is how users will communicate with the back end. And the front end is what consists of HTML, JavaScript components that you've already been playing around with, CSS included. So we are going to demo walking through some HTML and JavaScript again. In today's demonstration, we're going to be specifically writing out some functions that will act like very typical API requests. We are also going to import Bootstrap. Actually, I'm not sure if we'll cover this. Have you guys played with Bootstrap yet in any of your challenges or exercises?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. If it's in the lesson, we'll cover it. I think it might have been removed. It's something that will be covered again later on during the React portion, for sure. And we are going to load images from two different image APIs into a single container. Okay, let's talk about Bootstrap. So actually, let me pull this down real quick so I can run through today's lesson super quick. Okay, cool. It does look like we're going to be referencing Bootstrap. CSS Bootstrap is basically a library with lots of documentation. If we were to look it up right now, it's got a lot of let's say components that we can import and utilize. So things like buttons, images, forms, tables. And it's designed to be very easy to pick up and use. CSS Bootstrap is basically a way to create templates, cascading style sheet templates very easily but you could also overwrite anything within this framework with like manual CSS, and there are different ways of doing that. So you could have subsequent CSS files to override that. You could also utilize internal CSS where you're adding CSS to your code, or specifically inline CSS where you're adding the style sheets to your HTML file. So for example, if we have a link element inside of our HTML file, we can reference a style sheet, which will allow us to overwrite any styles in a previous style sheet that's been loaded. We can also, within code block, specify using style tags what kind of styles we want to apply to the children of an element. And we can also directly inside of an element specify some CSS. So in the example that we're going to run through today, we are basically using a link to import CSS Bootstrap. And we are going to be utilizing very simple components, the nav class, the nav bar wrapper, and a style sheet. And for the JavaScript portion, we'll be referencing some API URLs. And we're basically going to be writing out event listeners to create API requests. And let's see. I think you should already be familiar with. We kind of went over this last week. We went over DOM and what the document object model is, how it loads the elements in an HTML document into your browser. We use query selector for selecting element objects. And if you remember, you're able to target specific elements using things like ID or class. There's more than one way of doing that. These are all done through events, and events can be done through things like clicking on an item, loading a page, clicking on a button, and basically the pattern is you create an event listener to listen for these events, and you call the code that needs to be executed once these events are triggered. So you should have already been doing this in some of your exercises, but like I said, you can reference elements specifically using their IDs or their classes. And yeah, that's about it. It's a very simple lesson today, I guess. Does anyone have any questions? I feel like this is very simple graphic. I don't even remember why I added it, but when you interact with a button on the front end, it basically calls an event listener, which actually should be down next to the button in front end because the event listener will still exist client side, but that's what calls the callback function, which then renders the data in your browser. Let's see. Oh, yeah, this is a cool link. I'll share it in Zoom that gives you documentation for all sorts of accessible events in a browser. And for the exercise, we're going to run through the basic demo that's inside of the README, and I'll be creating a new repository with some additional stretch goals because I'm pretty sure you guys should be able to get through the other challenge way before the end of the day. So with that said, let's run through our demonstration. So what I have so far is a very basic index.html. We have some elements that are defining our meta parameters. We are referencing a style sheet using this link to CSS Bootstrap. And we are also loading an app.js file, which is empty right now. If we look inside of our page, the click me button does absolutely nothing. So let's start adding some code to make it do stuff. All right, I'm going to drag this back up here. First, let's talk about user stories. When you are, well, let's say if you land a job as a software engineer, as opposed to like, let's say, sysadmin or DevOps engineer, you're probably going to be working with user stories. And user stories, if you're not familiar with them already, are basically ways to talk through how the user is going to navigate your application. It's a way of thinking about the functionality you're going to build out from the perspective of the user. So it's very much like pseudocoding, right? So for our demonstration today, some user stories that we want to think about because we're writing a simple web application that pulls users. When I first go to the website, I want to be able to see a button, which we have right here. When I click on the button, I want to see a list of users, which we don't have yet. When looking at a list of users, I want to be able to click the same button to remove all the users. And then finally, I want to be able to show and remove users over and over again. So since we're already done with user story 1, let's jump straight into user story 2. So we've got this already. We've got our CSS. We've created our app.js file. The first thing we're going to do is add an event listener. So inside of our app.js, let's write out our event listener.
We can't see your code if you're trying to show it to us.
It's
Oh.
frozen on that page.
Shoot, my bad, guys. I've been dragging these windows all around for no reason. Okay, let me switch that. Man, I feel like I'm never gonna get used to this. Okay. Now I should be able to see my entire window. Yes?
Yeah, we can.
Cool. All right, so we are creating our event listener. So our event listener is going to be a button listener because we wanted to listen for interactions with our button. So let's create a constant variable called add button listener. And we're basically going to make this an anonymous function because we don't need it to return any data per se. So we use our arrow function, which I'm missing the arrowhead for, and we then specify the button that we are referencing. So we're going to use document.querySelector to look for an element called button. We then say, when this button is clicked, we want to pass this event to this behavior, which is targeting the inner text of the element and updating it to say clicked. Let's then load this method using Windows on load. Save, refresh. I need window to be singular, not plural. Refresh, error is gone. And now when we click on click me, it does nothing. Let's see. We need to go into our index.html, look at our button. Yep, it is a button. And
You need to call the function.
yes, you're right. I was missing my parentheses. And I also can't seem to target inner text.
Should it be target instead of targeting?
Oh, yes, good catch. Good catch. Ta-da, we now have a functioning button, add button listener. Okay, So now that we have fixed all of our errors and we have a functioning button, we can continue to actually implement the functionality we want to match user story number 2. So let's create a new function called get users. And this is what we're going to use to actually get our users. This is going to be an asynchronous request. So we type async, and then we continue our anonymous function. And we basically want a response, which we will retrieve using a fetch request. And we are going to be targeting this API provided by JSON placeholder. If we look at the documentation for JSON placeholder, it's a free fake REST API for testing and prototyping. And how does it work? It's very simple. We basically use fetch, we pass in a URL like so, and then we retrieve the response. We're not going to work with to-dos. Instead, we're going to work with users. If we look at the rest of the documentation, we see that there are users available at this endpoint. So let's update our code to include this URL. Now we want to define a body and say await this response and then return. Now we also want to replace this behavior here with the behavior of this method. So let's refresh, save, refresh. We click, it still updates the clicked, but it looks like the get users method is not doing anything because we're returning a body, but not exactly placing it anywhere in our document. So let's do a console.log just to see if we're getting the body at all. Let's save, refresh, click, and bam. When we hit the button, it calls get users, and we are able to see the users retrieved from this API. All right. So we want to actually render this list of users in our document. So let's create some elements specifically for these users. I'm going to write a new function called create user element. And it's going to be something where I pass in a user. And then we have to create our divs and yeah, let's start with a div. We're going to do document create element. We're going to call this a div to contain the name and the rest of the information we want for each user. And then we're going to create a new variable called name, which is going to be a text element. And let's use a header because it's the name. And then we could create a new variable for the email address of the user. Because if we look at the response, we have names. We have a lot of information, actually. We have addresses, companies, IDs, but right now we're going to target email. So let's do create element. And let's just make this a simple P element, paragraph element. And let's then say name.text content equals user.name. And the email text content will be pulled from the user's email in the response. And we're going to name the class list group item so that we could target it with some CSS. Now let's do div.append child. This way, the name and email will belong to the div that we created. And then let's return that div. So now we want to call create user element. Actually, I think we're still missing something. Let's say const draw users equals users. And this is basically, you're going to use a query selector, select main. And we're going to iterate through the list of users. And let's append this to a div. All right, now we can call in our add button listener, we are going to call, well, let's actually attach the response to this request to a variable. So instead of just calling get users, which will console log the body, we don't need this console log. I guess it doesn't hurt to keep it actually. But let's say users JSON, it's going to be the name of the variable. And we are going to use an await. And since we're using an await, I think we have to make sure that this is an asynchronous function. Okay, so no more complaints from VS Code. And now we could call the draw users method that we defined up above. So let's see all of this in action. Save, refresh. And we get an error. User JSON is not defined. Add button click. Is it users?
Is it because you have users plural, but in your call you have users singular?
It is. Let's fix that. Good catch. And I'm just gonna run through, make sure I don't have any other issues. And it looks like we're good to go. When I called this method, it pulled up their users, and then it iterated through the users, and it assigned them all to a div. It then renders all of the divs, giving us our list of users. So that's user story number 2. If we go back to our README, our next user story is, when looking at the list of users, I want to be able to click the same button to remove all the users. So it sounds like we're going to go update our add button listener and give it a conditional so that if there are users, we change the behavior. So let's start by, what's one way? Yeah, let's start by creating our state. We'll use the state as a way of tracking whether or not we are creating or removing users. So let's say const state equals is users loaded, and we are going to give this initial value of false. And then let's create the method we're going to use to actually reset or remove the users. Actually, sorry, this method will reset the state, and because we want to be able to toggle the state, and then we'll have a method for removing the users. So state dot is users loaded. We're first checking to see if users are in fact loaded. And if the state returns false, then our button will, which we first have to use query selector to target, our button will say we're going to use a ternary to change the value of what it renders based on the state that is returned. So we check if is users loaded is true or false. If it is true, then we say get users. And if it's false, we say remove users. All right, now we want to actually define our method for removing users. Let's say class main equals document that query selector main, because somewhere inside of our index we have something called main. And whoops. That's what I want. And then let's say while the first element in main remove the child. All right. Now that we have this, we need to actually update the function inside of our add button listener. So here we have our add button listener updating the text to clicked. We could probably get rid of that now. And then it's retrieving the users. But instead of doing that, instead of retrieving and rendering the users, we're going to add a conditional. So if the state of is users loaded is false, then we want to load the users. So that's where we move this stuff in here. So this line is to make the API request to get the users, and then this is what renders the users. Otherwise, we are going to call our new remove users method. And after all of this happens, we are going to reset our state. So let's save, reload, and click. We now see that our button says get users. Click on it again. We've removed our users. I think it might make more sense if the text was reversed, but we more or less have user story 3 complete. User story 4 is now, I want to be able to show and remove users over and over again. Actually, looks to me like that's exactly what we're doing. So we've completed all of our user stories. Any questions? What do you guys think? Easy?
I'll probably have to dive into it a little bit, but yeah, for the most part, it seems like I understand like each little individual piece, but then putting it all together, I think I'd have to kind of do it myself before I fully grasp it.
Awesome. Yeah, no, definitely. I agree with you there. Yeah, so you could go ahead and jump straight into that before the challenge and work in groups. Right. I was going to add some stretch goals. So I'll actually create a new repository with those stretch goals, and I will update the README. I might just update the README actually with the stretch goals as opposed to creating an entirely separate new repository. Either way, they'll be there. Run through this demo on your own, and you'll also have a challenge called, what is today's challenge? Front end for HTTP server, which again is a fairly quick exercise, and it's going to involve some troubleshooting. All right. Any questions?
Yeah, just that reset thing you did at the end of the button listener. So I'm assuming that just kind of like, does that just reset all the values to what they initially are, or what does that do? Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot that you defined that. Never mind. Whoops.
Okay. Yeah. No problem. No worries. Cool. All right, I am gonna set up breakout rooms. So go ahead and take a 15-minute break, and once you're back, you'll have your groups ready.